Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go back down the rabbit hole that is the law. And we're going to talk about express and implied agreements and how the carriers use them to their advantage in the Railway Labor Act. It's going to be a short discussion that concerns the Conrail decision, which a lot of us have heard about but don't know a whole lot about, and also the recent BLET versus the Union Pacific case that came out of the 7th Circuit. We've all heard from our local officers that when carriers make a change to our work rules, they just say they can do that. But when asked why, you get the reply, well, they just can. Bull. The carriers can do this because they've been allowed to do it over the years. Again, what follows is a brief description and explanation as to how this is applied to written and non-written agreements that we work under. We've all heard the reference to the Conrail decision as the carrier's basis for justification to make changes to our agreement, both express, which is written, and implied, which means through the action of the parties. Again, what follows is a brief description of those two cases and how it applies. Conrail was formed in 1976, and since it began operation, it required employees to undergo physical examinations. There were normal and scheduled physicals and return to work physicals. The periodic or normal physicals were for every employee every 3 years up to the age of 50, and then every 2 years thereafter. Or when an employee was out of service for a prolonged period of time due to furlough, leave, suspension, or other similar causes. Or for cause due to an employee condition, when the employee had suffered a heart attack or a stroke or other similar catastrophic medical event, or when they were diagnosed with hypertension, diabetes, or epilepsy. If the employee failed the exam, they were held out of service until the condition was corrected, eliminated, or brought under control. And in any event, blood sugar and in some circumstances, drugs were tested for during any of these physicals. During this period of time, the unions allowed Conrail to make and implement any and all changes to the physical exam policy without challenge. Then, in 1987, Conrail announced that it would include drug screenings as part of all periodic and return from leave physical examinations. The union decided this was a bridge too far. They challenged the action on Conrail's part as being a major dispute. Conrail countered, saying that it was a minor dispute as the physical exams that it had unilaterally been able to implement and change had become part of the implied agreement between the parties. The U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania agreed that it was a minor dispute and ordered arbitration. The unions appealed and the 3rd Circuit overturned it, finding that it was a major dispute. The case was then appealed and accepted by the Supreme Court. In finding that the issue involved a minor dispute, the Supreme Court looked to the actions of both parties to determine if a contract or agreement existed. In support of this, the court stated, as the parties acknowledge, however, collective bargaining agreements may include implied as well as express terms. Furthermore, it is well established that the parties' practice, usage, and customs is of significance in interpreting their agreement. This court observed that a collective bargaining agreement is not an ordinary contract for the purchase of goods and services, nor is it governed by the same old common law concepts which control such private contracts. It is a generalized code to govern a myriad of cases which the draftsman cannot wholly anticipate. A collective bargaining agreement covers the whole employment relationship. It calls into being a new common law, the common law of a particular industry or of a particular plant. This is what's now known as the common law of the shop. The court went on to find that since Conrail had routinely required employees to undergo physical examinations, neither party disputed the fact and agreed that the examinations were an implied term of the collective bargaining agreement established by long-standing past practice and acquiesced to by the union. Finally, in the end, the union's arguments distinguishing drug testing from other aspects of Conrail's medical program and asserting that Conrail's true motive was disciplinary could conceivably carry the day in arbitration. But they do not convince us, being the court, that Conrail's contractual arguments are frivolous or insubstantial. Conrail's interpretation of the range of its discretion as extended to drug policy is supported by the general breadth of its freedom of action in the past and by its practice to including drug testing within routine medical examinations in some circumstances. So what does this mean? Since the unions never challenged Conrail's right to require physical examinations, and drug testing was to be included as part of those physical examinations, Conrail had established its ability to unilaterally dictate what would be included in a physical examination. Such ability had then become an implied term of the collective bargaining agreement, and therefore the dispute was a minor dispute under the Railway Labor Act and as such subject to arbitration. The best solutions the unions could obtain, which was the one they did obtain, was that since physical examinations were part of the implied bargaining agreement, arbitration was its only resort since it was a minor dispute. Recently, this principle was amplified in the case of BLET versus the Union Pacific. The decision was handed down by the 7th Circuit in 2001. If you don't know the facts, we'll just summarize them. In 2020, the Union Pacific informed the BLET that it was implementing a points-based attendance policy. This is one of many attendance policies that the Union Pacific had implemented in the last 20 years or so. The BLET viewed the policy as such a substantial modification to the prior policies that the policy, in the BLE's opinion, was a major dispute. The carrier stated it was a minor dispute and therefore only subject to arbitration. Both the District Court and the Court of Appeals concurred that the dispute was a minor one. This is because the carrier has a very light burden when it comes to persuading the courts. Quoting the decision, "When a railroad labor dispute reaches a federal court, our central responsibility is that of taxonomists, or a person that divides organisms into different categories, classifying the dispute as major or minor. Given the Railway Labor Act's strong preference for arbitration, a railroad bears a relatively light burden in persuading the court that its actions is pursuant to an existing contractual authority and is a minor dispute under the Railway Labor Act." So all a carrier has to do is show that they've been able to do whatever they've done in the past without challenge from the unions, and the dispute becomes a minor dispute because the carrier's actions have become part of the implied bargaining agreement. Taking the BLET to task over their non-action, the 7th Circuit stated, "It is undisputed that Union Pacific has unilaterally imposed changes in the attendance policy for at least the past 22 years. In 1998, the company launched a system-wide attendance policy for locomotive engineers known as the Union Pacific TY&E attendance policy. This policy was not bargained for with the Brotherhood. Union Pacific unilaterally modified that policy in 1999. It did so again in 2004, 2006, 2011, 2015, 2017, and 2018, all without going to the bargaining table. The quote continues, "The point of this tally is not to cement the number of times a railroad must act to establish a course of dealing, but this history does show that a pattern, in turn, establishes beyond dispute that Union Pacific stood on solid ground in considering the Brotherhood's challenge to the attendance policy modifications to reflect a minor dispute, a challenge to the company's exercise of authority implied and established as part of an existing collective bargaining agreement through the parties' course of dealings." So what does this mean? It should be clear that when a carrier wants to implement a change in specific work rules, one that has never been implemented before in any shape or form, it must be challenged. If there is nothing that the carrier can point to as a past practice, it may be considered a major dispute. Allowing the carrier to implement work rule changes and then trying to challenge them will result in the carrier invoking its relatively light burden when the time comes for future changes in work rules. And we all know that once the camel's nose is under the tent flap, it's nearly impossible for them to keep them from coming in. In short, we can't give the carriers an inch. When work rule changes are implemented, the general chairman must go to the carriers and say, "This is a new work rule. You don't have any authority to do this. Therefore, we need to bargain with it as it's a minor dispute." Otherwise, when that challenge is lost or not made, then any other changes that happen subsequent to that will be a minor change and will be back in arbitration. Ladies and gentlemen, you can't give them an inch.